And now I'm delighted to be joined by Ambassador Extraordinaire and now Blogger Extraordinaire, Mr. Craig Murray. Craig, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, yours has been quite an extraordinary career. But let's start with, let's start at the beginning. I mean, people who know you, Craig Murray, many of the things you write about, your advocacy of Scottish independence, you know, have you marked down as a pretty thrawn Scot, a lad of parts. But actually, you were born in Norfolk, were you not?
I was indeed. I was born down in Norfolk. My father, from Edinburgh, was posted down there in the Air Force, where he married a local girl and settled down for a while. So I'm half Scots and half English, and born in Norfolk. And
got in politics at a pretty early age. I mean, reading accounts of your life, Mr. Jeremy Thorpe, then leader of the Liberal Party, the Right Honourable Jeremy Thorpe, his private secretary received a letter in the post, because that's what they did in these days, and just in the run-up to the February 1974 election. What was that about?
That's right. I decided I was a Liberal when I was, I think, 14 years old. And we didn't have a candidate in North Norfolk. We didn't have a constituency association. So I wrote to Jeremy Thorpe asking him to send a candidate. And his private secretary, who was Richard Moore, opened the letter and, having no constituency himself, hopped on a train and came to fight the election. And when he arrived and found that a young teenager was the constituency association, he was.
What age were you then?
I was just 15, I think.
So this Jeremy Thorpe's private secretary from Westminster, or from his constituency office, whatever, gets a letter, decides that he will be that candidate. That's a great way to do things. arrives in Norfolk, but at the train station, looks for the deputation to greet him on arrival, and finds this schoolboy who'd written the letter. Hadn't you mentioned in the letter about your age of innocence?
No, I hadn't. And in fact, as he arrived at the station, I'd just come off the school bus, so I was in my school uniform with my satchel as well, I think. But he took it all in very good part.
From that standing start, how did you get on in the election campaign?
We did not too badly. I think we actually came third. I don't think we managed to overtake the Labour Party, which was the aim. But we got, for memory, we got something like 18–20% of the vote. So
well, Mr. Moore must have enjoyed the experience, because he stood again in October of that year in the same constituency. By then, did you have a burgeoning constituency association?
We certainly did. We attracted lots of members. We revived the constituency association. Thankfully, a lot of the members were older than I was. And it was really my introduction to politics. And actually, Richard Moore taught me, a great many of the political principles in which I still believe. He was a very good Liberal man with both a large and a small L. And
then off to Dundee University. Was that because of your father's connection? You were a second-generation Scot?
Yes, I went off to Dundee, and I was still active in Liberal politics there.
And you got active in student politics, and if I read correctly, there was a change in the rules of the student association by the university to stop you standing for a third term. It was like Franklin D. Roosevelt, or that there had to be a constitutional amendment to stop Craig Murray being a perpetual student.
Well, that's right. I did 2 sabbaticals as president of the Students' Union. The university was terrified I was going to do a third. It wasn't just the constitution of the Students' Union. They had to change the university charter itself and get the Queen to sign off on the change, which was fascinating. I had, it's worth saying, no intention whatsoever of standing for the third term anyway, because I'd managed to get a job in the Foreign Office. But just in case, they weren't taking any chances.
Well, the Foreign Office, because I went through the Government Economic Service exams, and indeed the Treasury had a reputation for looking at people not basically dismissing people who might be considered unorthodox, but looking for brains as opposed to conformity in these days. Do you think that's gone from the civil service now?
It would be much more difficult now to get in if you have unorthodox political views, let me put it that way. After I left the Foreign Office, a friend of mine, still in a senior position in the office, was invited to a meeting to discuss the Craig Murray case. And he went along thinking that it might be discussing how you avoid making false allegations against one of your staff or some of those things. But in fact, it turned out to be a meeting on how to ensure nobody like Craig Murray ever got in the Foreign Office again.
That's an interesting insight. Well, let's get back to you emerged, top of your year or near the top through the Foreign Office examinations, and then your initial postings as a young civil servant, a young Foreign Office operative, were in Poland and then Ghana. So what were the highlights of your sojourn in Poland?
Well, Poland was absolutely fascinating because it was going through the transition from communism to capitalism, in effect. I was there in the early 90s. And it was a time of enormous opportunity. New businesses were burgeoning up, people were enjoying newfound freedoms. But also there was a terrible sadness that a whole generation of people who had been brought up in the communist system lost their way. There were literally hundreds of thousands of people laid off from heavy industry, for example, who would never work again. Economically, people were in real poverty and starvation almost. It was a bit like what happened to the UK under Thatcherism, but exaggerated, still far, far worse. So it really was a very interesting time to be there, but also quite complicated, a time both of hope and of despair, depending on who you were in society.
Now, on Her Majesty's service, you had your first direct contact with Her Majesty herself in Poland, and I think Prince Charles in Ghana, which was one of your next postings. Why were you cavorting with royalty, a man of your views?
Yeah. I had to organise state visits for the Queen, both to Poland and to Ghana, while I was in those countries, purely by coincidence that state visits happened to come to both countries while I was there. And organising a state visit, you actually end up getting quite close to the Queen and the royal family.
And so the visits must have been accorded something of a success, because you were offered some royal acknowledgement. So tell us about that, and in particular, tell me why you didn't accept it.
Yeah, no, I was offered an officership in the Royal Victorian Order, which is a medal and a personal gift of the Queen. I was offered a lieutenantship or lieutenancy of the Royal Victorian Order while I was in Poland, and I was promoted, in a sense, and offered to be a commander of the Royal Victorian Order while I was in Ghana, and on both occasions I refused.
And were there inquiries from the palace as to why you turned down these singular and very personal honours bestowed by Her Majesty the Queen?
Yes, the Queen asked me directly.
Person to person?
Person to person. I had a one-on-one interview with her for her to thank me for my work at the end of the tour. And she asked me why I'd refused, and I told her that it was because of my beliefs, that I'm a Republican and also a Scottish nationalist, so I couldn't accept honours from the British Crown. And
what was the Queen, Her Majesty's reaction to that?
She took a few seconds to digest it, looked slightly confused, and then quite literally she said, how nice.
That's not a bad reaction at all, actually, but your turning down of the honour wasn't a break with royalty, because then you were in charge of Prince Charles's visit, I think, in Ghana, and Ghana's remained a continuing interest of yours. And that too was judged a considerable success. What was the highlight of your Ghanaian posting?
The highlight of my Ghanaian posting was really the general election of 2000, when Jerry Rawlings had been ruling the country for 20 years or more, supposedly in the last 8 as an elected president, although the country was still effectively pretty much a dictatorship in many ways. And bringing that period to an end, and being very involved with DFID in the organisation of the Ghanaian election, that was, for me, the biggest highlight of my time in Ghana.
So the Foreign Office, this man, Murray, despite turning down royal honours, nonetheless seems to be set for a glittering diplomatic career. After your success adjudged in Poland and Ghana, you're appointed an ambassador in your early 40s. Now, that is uncommon. I mean, to reach so you're ambassador to Uzbekistan, you're in the embassy at Tashkent, you're in your early 40s, you've got 20 years or more of Foreign Office activity before you. The expectation as one of the youngest ambassadors in the whole service is you would end up as ambassador in Washington or Paris, or reach the very heights of the Foreign Office. So you must have thought, as you arrived to take up your post I'm pretty well set for a career of glittering prizes.
That's probably true. I mean, I was the youngest ambassador at the time of my appointment. I was anticipating probably my next appointment would be ambassador to Poland. Given that the Foreign Office had been to a great expense to teach me Russian, I'd probably finish as ambassador to Russia. Something along those lines was my, the career path that I'd plotted out for myself. And there was every reason to believe that was going to happen.
You were confronted in Tashkent in Uzbekistan with activities which increasingly troubled you. So what were these things that were going on, and how did you take action?
I hadn't been there very long when I discovered that really the dictatorship which was running Uzbekistan was a dreadful dictatorship, and they were practicing torture of a most horrible kind. And then I discovered that we were engaged in security service cooperation with them and were receiving intelligence material from these torture sessions.
When you say we, you mean the United Kingdom security forces and the Foreign Office?
Yeah, I mean, essentially the CIA and MI6 were receiving intelligence material from the Uzbeks that came from these torture sessions.
But when this was in the aftermath of 9/11, the Iraq War was on its way. This was a time of international terrorism, of Al-Qaeda rampant. I mean, didn't you judge, well, these are exceptional times and perhaps exceptional measures might be justified in that context?
I think there are three main points to answer that. The first one is I think torture is just always immoral and should never be resorted to. The second one is that, of course, this kind of behaviour is what makes people hate us and what causes terrorism as opposed to stop it. And the third and very practical one is you don't get the truth from torturing people. Under torture, people will say anything to make the torture stop. And what the torturer wants to hear is not necessarily the truth. And what the torturers wanted to hear in this case were confessions to membership of Al-Qaeda in order to exaggerate the strength of Al-Qaeda in Central Asia, in order to justify all the hundreds of millions of dollars that were being pumped into the regime by the United States. So, the material coming out of it was false material.
So your first recourse was to make representations internally. I mean, you're the ambassador. You must have had access to the top of the Foreign Office, access perhaps to the Foreign Secretary, but then was Jack Straw was in post. So you must have made these internal representations. So, I mean, what was the response to our man in Tashkent saying, look, things are not as they seem here. I'm increasingly troubled. I'm looking for direction as to how we can steer things into a more honourable course.
I did exactly that. I sent telegrams back to Jack Straw, as an ambassador can, marked top secret, saying we are receiving this intelligence from material from torture. It's unreliable material, we shouldn't be getting it, and it's illegal in terms of a UN Convention against torture to receive this material, and I'm concerned about the legal position ministers are putting themselves in by receiving it. I sent a telegram saying that at the end of 2002 and repeated it in January 2003, having received no answer. And I was then called to London, rather than get a written answer. I was called to London to a meeting in the Foreign Office. The very first thing I was told was that the Foreign Office was angry with me because such things should never ever be put in writing.
So you got nowhere? I mean, was there any supporters in government? I mean, how about the International Development Secretary at the time would be Claire Short? I mean, she'd a woman with well-known radical view. Did you think of saying, or were you not allowed to, as the ambassador, contact the International Development Department?
I mean, I was told very firmly within the Foreign Office that Jack Straw had taken the view that we should get intelligence from torture in the context of the war on terror, but this was necessary. I had very little support from within the Foreign Office at an official level. I had a fair amount of personal messages of support from other ambassadors, but nothing.
Were there other colleagues in similar positions around the world?
There would have been many colleagues in the same position around the world, but nobody else seemed willing to put their career on the line about it in the way that I was willing to do.
So then you took a very unusual step, but still within the realms of proper Foreign Office behaviour. You made an open public criticism of the judicial system of Uzbekistan and various other aspects that were going on, and you did it as the ambassador and you cleared your speech through the Foreign Office. How long did that take to get cleared?
That was quite hard work to get it cleared. I decided that we had to go public on the human rights abuses that were occurring, including one instance of a gentleman being boiled to death. He was boiled alive, literally. And I'd got pathological proof of that from the University of Glasgow Institute of Pathology. So I decided we needed to go public, and I went through those parts of the Foreign Office which deal with human rights and through DFID to clear the speech.
And was it this particular case, somebody being, as you put it, boiled alive? Was that a feature of your speech, or was it more generally about torture, about illegal rendition, which was an issue which was undergoing at that time?
The speech didn't discuss rendition. It discussed the torture that was happening and did give the specific example of a chap being boiled to death. But also...
And you say you had that confirmed by the University of Glasgow. Was that when you were still ambassador, or was that later in the...
No, that was while I was still ambassador. I'd received detailed photos of the corpse while I was ambassador, and I'd sent those photos back to the Foreign Office, to the Human Rights Department of the Foreign Office, and they had sent them to the University of Glasgow for analysis. And the analysis had come back saying that the chap had been boiled alive.
So to say the least, this speech caused a bit of a stir and brought you into pretty open conflict with your American equivalent. Their man in Tashkent wasn't particularly pleased with the activities of our man in Tashkent. What happened then?
Yeah, the American ambassador was most upset, and he called me to a meeting where we discussed our different views. And he took the view that Islam is in itself an attack on human rights, in effect, was what he said to me, and that I had to realize that the Uzbek government was fighting Islam, and that we should be giving them our every support, and that these minor human rights abuses were not the main thing I should be concentrating upon. I wasn't seeing the big picture, was his view. I also got quite a firm attack from London, coming down from the minister's office, saying that they were most concerned I'd upset our American allies. I did point out that I had cleared the speech. They were still not impressed. They said that I knew what I was doing. I knew that I was going against wider policy objectives.
And then things took a altogether different turn. You found yourself at the receiving end, having been the person who was making the allegations, making the statement, at the receiving end of a Foreign Office investigation.
That's right. And it came as a huge shock to me. I was on holiday with my family, and I was called back to the Foreign Office to a meeting in the personnel department of the Foreign Office. And at that meeting, it was put to me that I was having policy conflicts with the office, and perhaps I'd rather go and be ambassador somewhere else. And they suggested Denmark. They said that Copenhagen was coming up, and wouldn't it be better for me if I just quietly went to Copenhagen? And before I could actually answer that, they said, take a couple of days to think about it. But then the chap produced from a drawer of his desk a list of 18 allegations and said, if you don't agree, then we're going to have to investigate these allegations. And I was just absolutely stunned by the sheer bluntness of the blackmail, the lack of subtlety about it. And these allegations were just absolute rubbish. I mean, they were just completely untrue, things I'd never done. I was astonished. I was astonished this could be happening. I actually encountered, some psychological difficulties in believing this really was happening to me in the real world.
So you decided to fight, and you fought successfully. The charges were dismissed, but your career was over. Your career in the Foreign Office was over. Instead of going to the glittering heights of the Moscow embassy or elsewhere, that was the finish of that. So how did you pick yourself up? I mean, that's a considerable thing to happen in your mid-40s and in mid-career, and the circumstances must have hurt you a great deal.
It was horrible. I mean, it was very, very difficult. I went through a period of great poverty. I mean, I don't come in any sense from a moneyed background, and I had no other source of income. And on top of which, the events precipitated a divorce. Everything collapsed on me. I lost my I lost my job, I lost my family, I lost my income, I lost my standing in society. I lost my friends because, as I say, the people doing this to me were my friends. I'd been in the Foreign Office for over 20 years, and an awful lot of people who knew me very well knew that the allegations against me were untrue, and that was eventually proven. Yet still they sort of went along with the official line that I was an unreliable and terrible person and needed to be got rid of. So the whole psychological experience of it was very, very difficult to come out of. And for a year or two, I was very down indeed.
But you had support, I mean, and the cross-party support. We mentioned Claire Short, Daniel Hannan, the Conservative Euro MP. These were people who were suspicious of what had happened to you and were advocates in your favour.
That's true. Michael Portillo, also quite a few people from the Conservative Party were very supportive. But there were people across political lines who did come out in my support. One of the very difficult things was that once I'd been sacked, in effect, I felt able to go public on the things I'd been keeping secret, like the extraordinary rendition that was happening. But Jack Straw stood up in Parliament and, referring to me by name, said that it wasn't true and that extraordinary rendition didn't exist and it was a figment of the imagination. And he said that, you know, you would have to believe that the Americans and the British were colluding and sending people around the world to be tortured. I was in effect being called a liar in Parliament, and that's, you know, extremely difficult to cope with. Now, of course, I haven't met anybody for a decade who doesn't believe me and doesn't believe I was the one telling the truth. But at that time, it wasn't that straightforward.
I'm talking today to Craig Murray, once our man in Tashkent, Her Majesty's ambassador to Uzbekistan, and now one of the foremost bloggers in the land. Craig, you continued as this figure outside, well outside the establishment now, even although as the Iraq War came to a conclusion and people started to emerge. I mean, the Iraq War was interesting. There was huge opposition before it started. Then there was a period where the opposition was muted, and then the doubts started to emerge. And as people realised the extent of the false trail of intelligence, then many of the views which had looked controversial, even crackpot, started to suddenly gain currency.
But that's very true. I was vindicated, if you like, in public in my assessment of the value of the intelligence. I used to be head of the FCO unit responsible for surveillance of Iraqi attempts at weapons procurement. So I knew very well that the dossier on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction was nonsense. And I confirmed it with people, including people who had been involved in writing it. So I had known all along, even from within the office, and even from literally the day it was produced, that the intelligence on Iraqi WMD was fake.
But then you got electoral validation, if you're looking for, not from a parliamentary constituency, but from your old university in Dundee, where you were elected Lord Rector, a very interesting and unique aspect of the old university system in Scotland, where the head of the university is an elected post, elected by the students in the main, but some university students and staff. So Dundee University elected you as the Lord Rector. How did you feel about that?
Well, I thought it was great to come back as director, especially 20 years or 25 years after the university had amended its charter to stop me holding any posts in the university. It was.
And who invited you to stand and why?
I was invited by some students who were against the war in Iraq and who had seen me as a champion for anti-war views they could put up as a candidate for rector in a university which was very establishment dominated and in which the administration had rather close ties to New Labour.
And of course you were up against, as one of your main opponents, somebody rather more formidable than a politician, one of Scotland's sporting stars, a very famous rugby player. So how was that contest? I mean, did you debate weapons of mass destruction? And what was the Scotland's International's response to it?
It was, Yeah, Andy Nicol was my major opponent in the election. The position of rector, in my view, is very important because it gives the students a real say in the running of the university. The university administration much more interested in just having celebrity rectors who will purely carry out a PR role, but won't intervene on questions like tuition fees or class sizes or costs of student accommodation.
But it hasn't worked out for the University of Dundee because they've had a succession of rectors on the radical side of politics, because I think Brian Cox, the well-known actor, is one of your successors in Dundee.
Exactly. No, I'm happy to say that I started a new chain of activist rectors. The rector before me was Lorraine Kelly.
A very nice and effective television interviewer, of course. But nonetheless, so there you are. You've established this position in a way, vindicated and validated by the student body, but nonetheless, your position against torture, which everybody should support, but establishing them, because by then had not a subsequent foreign secretary amended the official position about illegal rendition. So your views are taken sway, but you continued to pursue the radical end of politics. And I'm quite interested as to why, having established your position, been vindicated in large measure, you didn't then say, well, perhaps it's time to look at a more establishment political career, or perhaps did you?
No, I don't think I ever considered looking for a mainstream career again. I felt I'd done that and done it very successfully in many ways. So what I'd seen, the actions of the state in, obviously, its complicity in torture, in falsifying the evidence on Iraqi WMD, had led me to the conclusion that the British state itself was something which needed to be undermined. It was not a tool for good in the world. I'd had a belief in Scottish independence really since my student days, when I'd been a good friend of Gordon Wilson, who was then leader of the SNP, and who I had actually proposed as a candidate to be rector of the university successfully, and was rector in my time. And Gordon had really converted me to Scottish independence. And I started to see Scottish independence not only as something desirable in itself, but as the tool which would break up the United Kingdom and then cause real problems for the neo-imperialist, neo-conservative foreign policy being pursued by the US and the UK.
So you're an abiding attachment to Scottish independence, because as a radical liberal student, you invited the leader of the Scottish National Party, the Member of Parliament for Dundee East, to stand for rector of the university. So the Scottish independence, you weren't a Johnny-come-lately to Scottish independence, but you returned to Scotland in 2014 to help in the referendum campaign led by some guy's name I can't remember, but nonetheless a very exciting and turbulent time in Scottish politics. So what was your role in the campaign, and how did you feel that did the campaign vindicate your hopes that radicalism would be alive in the country of your forebears? I'd
come up in, I think, 2012 and 2013 to speak to a couple of bodies like the Scottish Independence Convention, start giving speeches on independence. The end of 2013 onwards, I started to do more and more. And by the time the referendum was called, I was working almost full-time on it. And I decided, well, I'd better move up to Scotland. And I gave a large number of speeches all around the country during the campaign. And the excitement of it, the tremendous feeling of community involvement, and the fact, ordinary people who hadn't previously taken much interest in politics were coming out and talking not just about independence, but about what kind of society they wished Scotland to be post-independence. It was the most invigorating experience of my entire life. The communal feel of it was just fantastic, and to be in the middle of that campaign, and to be living through a period that felt revolutionary, day and night, and a time when political ideas from the radical side of politics were very openly being canvassed and discussed in the street. It was a life-forming experience for me. It came rather later in my life, but it absolutely transfigured my view what a good life is and what we should do and how we should work in society.
And you sought to be an SNP candidate in the 2015 election. Unfortunately, your hopes were dashed by the vetting committee, who perhaps found you a bit hot to handle.
Yeah, that's one of the the many disappointments in my life. In fact, after my activity in the referendum campaign, 13 constituency associations of the SNP, their executives, invited me to put myself forward as a candidate in 13 different constituencies. My great worry was working out, which ones to go for, really. But then I was turned down by the Central Vetting Committee on the grounds they said that they could not be sure that I would follow party discipline. And of course they were quite right. I wouldn't follow party discipline, but whether
I think they should have given you pass marks for honesty at the interview.
Well, exactly. I didn't lie in the vetting meeting. Maybe I should. But
well, I think the general form, and for when people are asked the question, will you always abide by the party whip and party discipline? You're meant to say yes. To that, an answer to that question. But you must have been buoyed to see the SNP elect 56 MPs out of the 59 constituencies. But by then, of course, you had found another outlet for your views at this incredibly successful blog, which, how many dedicated followers does it have now, Craig?
It's around the 300,000 unique visitor mark. But individual blog articles might get as much as 1.2 million people.
1.2 million. Now, did you have any conception, either when you started the blog or when you first encountered the social media revolution, that you would end up writing one of the most popular and well-read blogs on the planet, for that matter? Although I suspect some of these 1.2 million might be your old colleagues in the Foreign Office just checking on what you're up to.
It's certainly widely read by quite a lot of people in the Foreign Office. I started it actually, but nobody noticed, back when I was standing against Jack Straw in Blackburn. And I remember, if we got 300 people in a day to read it, I was really excited. The idea that you would be getting up towards millions seemed, absolutely impossible.
And then, in the run-up to 2014, a Scottish independence referendum arrives, and you return to the land of your forebears to campaign in it, and by then you've established an extraordinarily successful blog, the Craig Murray blog. These are the issues we're going to discuss in the second part of this interview. Craig, we've been talking about the issues that have been discussed in your blog. Some of these, what's the one you've been most proud of? Well, let's look over the last year or two. What's the issue you think has, either elicited the greatest response, or where you think you've said something that meant a great deal to people?
The largest number of viewers I've ever had for an individual article was 1.2 million on my own blog. And you must remember that, of course, you can multiply that because popular articles are always reproduced all over the internet. And that was an article on the Panama Papers, which were released giving details of people's offshore banking and tax dodging activities. And
this had ramifications across a range of countries. Even countries unexpectedly like Iceland were caught up in this release of information.
It did. But the point which I made was that there was a quite extraordinary lack of Americans featuring in these Panama Papers, and no major companies or no major individuals in either the UK or the US. And that this was wildly improbable. And in fact, the full Panama Papers never were published. There has never been an unredacted release of the...
Well, certainly they weren't being suppressed by WikiLeaks, which by its nature does not suppress things. So who's got them?
Well, the Panama Papers weren't released by WikiLeaks. They were released by a group called the Committee of Investigative Journalists, because the source who got them gave them not to WikiLeaks, but to a German newspaper who shared them through this journalistic cabal. And the newspapers redacted them. And the point which I was making about it was it would been much better if they'd been given to WikiLeaks or just released direct for net so we could actually see the raw material. And it did feel very much like it was very selective in terms of what material was being released and what material was being highlighted. And the idea of releasing through the mainstream media is not a sensible way if you want to get secrets out into the public.
So that was your most popular, most read blog in recent times. One of the most controversial, of course, has been your views on the Skripals and the Salisbury poisoning. Do you think you would, given what's been known, you would adjust any of your conclusions?
I don't think it's been proven who they were, and it's worth noting that the arrest warrant for them has not been amended into the names of the people supposedly identified by Bellingcat. But they plainly were not the innocent tourists they were made out to be. My own belief is we really do not know what happened. The British government story is absolutely full of holes. I did an article about a month ago on 10 points that I don't believe on the Skripal story, and nobody's been able to refute or even attempted to refute those 10 points.
And that's one of the great controversies of the time. But other recent features in your blog, the Chagos Islands, which the show has done a couple of programmes on. I read your blog on the Chagos Islands, and what stood out from other reports was that you had clearly looked at every iota of the International Court of Justice judgment, which seems like a rather obvious thing for journalists to do, but you'd certainly done it. Why do you think it is in the conventional news media are not prepared or able to devote the time to have that textual examination of what the ICJ were about when they issued a stinging condemnation of the treatment of the Chagos Islanders?
I spent over 60 hours reading every detail, not just of the ICJ opinion and the advisory opinions, but all the legal judgments in the UK from the Supreme Court and the High Court and all the parliamentary debates, and just researching. And sadly, in the corporate media, they're no longer prepared to put the kind of resource into investigative journalism that's required to get that depth of knowledge and understanding of the subject. I should say, I was horrified by the things I discovered myself and by just how Machiavellian the machinations of the British government have been.
Well, that, of course, has been established by the ICJ. But another thing, isn't there a potential criticism, or isn't there a criticism that people would make, many of your erstwhile colleagues perhaps, that you look at every issue and always assume the worst of the British authorities or the American authorities? Take your recent activities in support of Julian Assange. Isn't there another side to the argument? Might there not be something in the view that, willingly or unwillingly, the WikiLeaks process has been used to undermine as opposed to consolidate democracy? On
the first question, I don't think I inevitably take an anti-Western line, let me put it that way. For example, on the Ukraine, my views are closer to the Western line than they are to the Russian line, just to give that as one example. On WikiLeaks, we should remember that WikiLeaks first came to real prominence with the release of the Afghan and Iraqi war logs, which gave enormous detail of actual definite war crimes and of the dreadful things that are being done in our name. My Chagos article drew on a WikiLeaks leaked American diplomatic cable which detailed a meeting between British and American diplomats where they were making up this idea of declaring an environmental protection zone, a maritime protection zone around.
And that is relatively recent, of course. For
Chagos.
people who think the Chagos Islands story just speaks ill of one of my great heroes, Harold Wilson, the British Prime Minister of the 60s and 70s, that particular episode was much, much more recent. That was the most recent Labour government activities with the Americans to the detriment of the Chagos Islanders.
That's right. And David Miliband was dressing up as environmentalism the exclusion of the islanders from their islands on the grounds they would be fishing, which is appalling. But it was absolutely cynical. They stated in terms in that meeting that the environmental lobby is stronger than the Chagos lobby. Therefore, this was a good political move to justify excluding the islanders from their own island.
And is your determination now to keep crusading on these causes, that your blog will still be there, that without fear or favour, exposing what you can of the truth and giving your trenchant opinions.
Yeah, I certainly intend to carry on. I would say I don't expect everyone to agree with everything on my blog. I possibly don't agree with everything on my blog. The idea is to provoke thought and give alternative viewpoint, but a well-researched and grounded, always, viewpoint. And that I intend to keep on doing.
In your career, if you looked at, have there been politicians, not necessarily establishment politicians, but politicians in establishment office who you've looked for great? I'm thinking actually Robin Cook and the ethical foreign policy which he attempted to pursue from 97 onwards. Now, that came to an end through internal machinations. But do you think that would have been a credible and possible stance, strategy for a British Foreign Secretary to pursue, or do you always think that forces, one way or another, would have pulled the rug from under it?
No, I think Robin Cook was essentially a good man and was trying to do the right thing in seeking a foreign policy based on morality, and came close to succeeding in some ways, but was, of course, stymied by Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell in many ways. And in fact, within a couple of weeks of his taking office, he was overruled at Cabinet on the sale of Hawk jets to Indonesia, where they were being used for bombing against East Timor. So he was always fighting an uphill battle against the forces of evil. I think it's not too strong a term, that were dominating New Labour.
Was there a feeling in the Foreign Office when Robin Cook became foreign, said, look, here's something new, different, there might be a chance to pursue a different approach to things? Or was there just trepidation that a lot of people might be asked to behave out of type?
I think the majority view in the Foreign Office was hostile to Robin Cook and to the idea of a more moral foreign policy. The people in the Foreign Office like to see themselves as practicing realpolitik and being the masters of dark arts of diplomacy. And the balance of opinion inside the Foreign Office is actually quite right-wing, contrary to popular myth. There were a few of us who were extremely hopeful. And I had joined the Foreign Office straight from university, and then I'd spent 12 years working for Tory governments. After that period of time, the chances of a change were very invigorating for many of us. But unfortunately, although he tried to do the right things in many ways, he was going to allow the Chagos Islanders back to the Chagos Islands, for example. But that's precisely the kind of reason why he was eventually forced out of the job.
I know, my sources tell me that recently you've been on a cricketing tour of Pakistan. And among your other lead cricketers who were on that tour was Peter Oborne, an extremely prominent journalist. I'm just interested in how you and Peter got on in that trip. And also, did you win the games?
No, I don't think we won any games. But Peter and I get on very well. We have common beliefs, particularly in civil liberties. Peter's a very old-fashioned kind of Tory, which sadly is becoming extinct in many ways, I think, who has firmly rooted right-wing views, but does believe in freedom, does believe in individual liberty, and does believe in social conscience. And I've never chosen my friends by their, by having similar political views to me. Otherwise, maybe I wouldn't have many friends.
So what you're telling me is that somebody from the radical edge of commentary and somebody as a conservative libertarian by the principle, even these forces combined couldn't win a single game in Pakistan.
I'm afraid that's true. We were bamboozled by spin of a different kind.
Craig Murray, I can't win any cricket games for you, but what I can do is present you with the Quake. As a Scot through and through, you've got no doubt what you do with the Quake. Whiskey in the Quake, round all with your many, many friends. And you can always blog about it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.